It was a gloomy autumn evening when I first moved into the small rental house on the outskirts of town. Nestled against a dense, unwelcoming forest, the house seemed charming in daylight, but as the sun sank behind the trees, shadows began to creep across the walls like dark fingers. I was a college student, excited to live independently for the first time, blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited me. The house had been vacant for nearly a year, and the previous tenants had left abruptly, leaving behind furniture covered in dust and an air of unease that clung to every corner. I shrugged it off, blaming my overactive imagination. After all, who really cared about a few cobwebs and creaking floorboards? The first night, everything seemed normal. I unpacked my belongings, arranged my books, and sat down with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the old windows. That's when I first noticed it, a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. At first I dismissed it as a rat or a bird that had found its way in. But then the sound grew louder, deliberate, almost human. My heart raced as I climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic door. I peered into the darkness, flashlight in hand. The attic was empty, just stacks of forgotten boxes and old furniture. I let out a nervous laugh and convinced myself it had been my imagination. But the next night, the noises returned, louder this time. Scratches, thumps, whispers in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to move closer with every passing hour, circling the house as if it were alive. I tried to sleep, tried to ignore it, but by 2 a.m., exhaustion gave way to terror. I resolved to investigate properly. I spent the following day searching the perimeter, inspecting windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like footsteps behind me. As night fell again, I made the mistake of going up to the attic. My flashlight beam trembled across the wooden floor, illuminating nothing, until I froze. A figure stood at the far corner, shrouded in darkness, impossibly tall and thin. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator's. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing my soul. I ran. I stumbled down the stairs, heart hammering, barely noticing the cold sweat soaking my shirt. I locked the attic door behind me and barricaded it with a chair. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I could do was sit in the living room, trembling, waiting for dawn to bring a fleeting sense of safety. Little did I know, that was only the beginning. The following morning, the sun did little to chase away the shadow of fear that had taken residence in my mind. I forced myself to eat breakfast, though the food tasted like ash in my mouth. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like footsteps approaching from the attic. I told myself repeatedly that it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. By mid-afternoon, I decided to do a more thorough search of the attic from a safe distance. I opened the door cautiously, keeping my flashlight ready. Dust motes danced in the beam, and the boxes I'd overlooked the day before seemed to loom larger than ever. That's when I noticed it, a faint trail of blackish footprints leading to the far corner. I froze. Footprints? In an empty, locked attic? My pulse quickened. I crouched, examining them closely. They were small, almost childlike in size, but distorted, with elongated toes and unnatural arches. My mind raced. How could this be? I hadn't been up here alone last night. Or had I? Ignoring my instincts screaming at me to leave, I followed the trail. The footprints disappeared beneath an old wooden chest. I tried to lift it, but it was too heavy. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. Leave, or join. The voice seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes, sending them crashing down in a cloud of dust. The whisper stopped. Silence. My heart pounded as I ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. That night, I could barely sleep. Every shadow became a potential threat, every gust of wind a sinister presence. The house seemed alive, breathing around me. At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of scraping along the living room floor. I gripped my baseball bat, shaking, and crept toward the noise. There, in the faint moonlight spilling through the window, I saw it. Two small figures, no taller than 3 feet, darted across the room. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glowed faint red in the darkness. They vanished before I could react, leaving only a cold breeze and the faint smell of decay. I barricaded the doors, locked every window, and stayed awake until sunrise. I called my parents, but they dismissed my fears as paranoia. I didn't blame them. Who would believe me? A grown adult, scared of tiny ghostly figures in an abandoned attic? Yet, I knew the truth. The house wasn't empty, and it hadn't forgiven the living for trespassing. Days passed, and the occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the attic seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I began keeping a journal, documenting every sound, every shadow, every fleeting glimpse of something unworldly. The more I wrote, the more the house seemed to respond. Shadows twisted toward me as I scribbled. The air thickened, and sometimes I could swear the walls themselves were watching. One night, unable to bear it, I decided to investigate the forest surrounding the house. Armed with my flashlight and a sense of dread, I stepped into the dense woods behind my property. The trees seemed impossibly tall, their branches like skeletal arms reaching down to scratch at me. I followed a faint path, half expecting the forest itself to guide me, and that's when I saw it. A small clearing, perfectly circular, with charred marks on the ground, like a ritual had taken place. In the center of the clearing lay a single, blackened doll. Its eyes were hollow, yet seemed to pierce through my soul. I picked it up cautiously. The instant my fingers touched it, the wind died, and the forest became unnaturally silent. Then, a whisper, soft but urgent. "You shouldn't have come." I dropped the doll and ran back to the house, heart hammering, lungs burning. That night, the whispers were louder, closer, surrounding me in every corner of the house. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the attic door, waiting for whatever was inside to finally reveal itself. By the end of the week, I realized I couldn't endure this alone. I needed help, someone who could see the truth. But even then, part of me feared that asking for help might bring the house's wrath upon them as well. And so, I prepared for the confrontation that was inevitable. The house had been waiting for me to understand something. A secret buried in the very foundation that would not stay hidden forever. The night after my venture into the forest, I knew I had to take precautions. I barricaded the attic door with every heavy piece of furniture I could move. Yet sleep still eluded me. Every creak, every groan of the old house felt magnified, amplified by my paranoia. The whispers were back, soft, insidious, seeming to come from the walls themselves. I spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling. That's when I realized it wasn't settling at all. The floorboards shifted under weight that shouldn't have existed, like something was pacing above me. The attic. I gripped my bat tightly, heart hammering. I couldn't run anymore, I needed to see it. By midnight, I had gathered my courage. Flashlight in hand, bat at the ready, I slowly ascended the attic stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath formed small clouds in the weak beam of light. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the attic greeted me with silence, at first. Then I saw them, more than one, moving in the shadows. Tiny, pale figures, their eyes glowing red in the darkness. They watched me, unblinking, waiting. My mind screamed to flee, but I forced myself to step forward. The beam of the flashlight danced over their faces. Each one seemed older than they should be, twisted by some unnatural age or curse. I noticed symbols carved into the floorboards beneath them, strange runes and circles that pulsed faintly under the flashlight. It was then I understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on fear, and these creatures were its guardians, its extensions. I could feel their gaze drilling into me, probing my thoughts, learning my weaknesses. Suddenly, one of them darted toward me, impossibly fast. I swung the bat blindly, and it dissipated into shadow before impact. The others moved in, surrounding me, whispering words I didn't understand, their voices layered and dissonant. Panic surged. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard, and hit the wall hard. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I couldn't stop. I ran toward the attic stairs, but the shadows were relentless. They multiplied, filling the room, their forms twisting and stretching, shifting like smoke. I barely made it down the stairs, slamming the door behind me, but I could hear them on the other side, scratching, whispering, trying to break through. The rest of that night was a blur. I stayed awake, listening, watching, until the first rays of sunlight broke through the windows. The shadows receded, melting back into the corners of the house. I knew it wasn't over. I realized I had to understand the history of the house if I wanted any chance of survival. I began researching the property, tracing back its previous owners. What I found chilled me. Every previous occupant had vanished under mysterious circumstances, some never leaving the house, others found wandering the nearby woods, incoherent and haunted, claiming the house wanted them. One document mentioned a family who had lived there in the early 1900s. The patriarch, a man named Horace Whitmore, was obsessed with the occult. He performed rituals in the woods behind the house, aiming to summon a guardian spirit to protect his family. But something went wrong. The spirit he summoned turned malevolent, claiming the house as its own and trapping the family within. They disappeared one by one, never to be seen again. It all clicked. The whispers, the shadows, the guardians. The house had become a vessel for something ancient and evil. And now, it had chosen me. Over the next few days, the attacks became more physical. Objects hurled themselves across rooms, doors slammed shut on their own, and whispers followed me wherever I went. I realized I couldn't stay in the house anymore, but leaving wasn't simple. Every exit seemed watched. Even stepping outside, I felt the gaze of the shadows lingering in the air, waiting for me to make a mistake. I made a plan. If I could gather enough light and protective symbols, maybe I could buy myself some time. Using everything I found in the research, old texts, drawings of protective sigils, even salt, I prepared a temporary sanctuary in the living room. Candles lined every corner, runes drawn on the floor and walls. I had no idea if it would work, but it was all I had. That night, the shadows came. They tested every boundary, slithering close, whispering threats in voices that weren't human. The temperature dropped, frost forming on the windows, and the house seemed to groan under some invisible weight. My sanctuary held, for a while, but I knew this was only temporary. The house was patient, and its hunger eternal. I had survived the night, but barely. The ordeal had changed me. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow, every sound reminded me that the house wasn't done with me. I had to find a way to end it, to sever its hold. But even as I thought that, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some houses, once claimed by darkness, never let go. And so I prepared, knowing the confrontation to come would determine whether I survived or became another whisper in the walls of the house in the woods. The following week was a nightmare of constant vigilance. Every sound, every shadow felt amplified. Even the wind outside sounded like whispers echoing through the trees, and every floorboard groan made me flinch. I began documenting everything: the movements, the noises, the whispers, the patterns. It became an obsession. The more I watched, the more I realized the house wasn't random. It had rules, almost like it was alive and thinking, testing me. One evening, I decided to explore the woods behind the house again. If Horace Whitmore had performed rituals there, maybe traces of his work remained, clues to undoing the curse. I equipped myself with flashlight, salt, protective charms, and a notebook, prepared for anything. As soon as I stepped into the dense forest, I felt it. The air was thick, heavy, like breathing underwater. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows twisting unnaturally. I followed a faint path I thought might lead to the old ritual site, only to discover an old stone altar partially covered in moss. Strange symbols were etched into it, pulsating faintly in the dim light of my flashlight. I knelt to examine them. Suddenly, a voice, a guttural whisper, echoed through the trees. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved, yet I could feel eyes on me from every direction. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I drew a protective sigil on the ground with salt, following the patterns from the texts I had found. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, circling, accusing. I could barely breathe. My hands shook as I traced each line. The air grew colder, my breath visible. Then, silence. Relieved, I straightened up and realized I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man, but his features were wrong, distorted, as if carved from nightmare itself. He moved in jerky, unnatural motions, circling the altar like a predator. I raised my flashlight, and the beam caught his face, pale, almost melting, eyes glowing faint red. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, the whispers now screaming unintelligible words. I burst through the tree line and into the backyard of my house. Safe, for a moment, I thought. But the shadows followed, seeping from the forest into my yard. That night, the house itself seemed to react to my discovery. The attic floorboards rattled violently. Furniture moved of its own accord, and the whispers were deafening. I barricaded myself in the living room, surrounded by candles and sigils, trying to create a protective circle. I whispered prayers, chants, anything to keep them at bay. The shadows pressed against my barriers, undeterred, whispering threats and promises of torment. I realized something crucial. The house was not just haunted. It was sentient. It fed on fear, learning, adapting. My previous tactics were temporary. It would find a way around them. I needed a permanent solution. I returned to the historical records of the Whitmore family, searching for anything that might indicate a way to banish the entity. I discovered an old journal, written in a code only partially decipherable, detailing rituals, sacrifices, and warnings. One passage caught my eye. The guardian must be given what it desires, willingly, or it will consume all who enter. Only a binding of true intent can imprison it again. The words chilled me. The entity wasn't just malicious. It was intelligent, aware, demanding. And I was about to become its target in a game I didn't understand. The following nights escalated further. I began seeing shapes, fleeting glimpses of figures watching from corners. Sometimes they were human, sometimes not. The shadows grew bolder, sometimes appearing in the rooms I slept in, leaving icy trails of breath in the air. Every object that could move did, in terrifying, deliberate ways. Chairs rocking, Pictures falling, doors slamming, mirrors fogging with messages I couldn't read. One night I awoke to a scratching on my bedroom window. I froze. The figure from the woods was there, or one of its minions. It pressed its distorted face against the glass, watching me. My chest tightened, and I felt like my soul was being weighed. I didn't dare move. It lingered, its eyes glowing in the faint moonlight, before slowly retreating into the darkness. By this point, I had lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together. Sleep became impossible. I barely ate. I had become a prisoner of the house, confined by fear, yet compelled to explore, to document, to survive. One morning, I decided I had to act. The rituals in the journal suggested that confronting the entity directly at the altar in the forest was the only way to bind it permanently. I gathered every protective charm, prepared my symbols, and carried a sharp blade I hoped would serve as a focus for the ritual. My heart raced as I stepped into the forest once more. The shadows waited. They had grown larger, more defined, taking on twisted humanoid shapes. The air was electric, charged with malice. As I approached the altar, the figure from the night before emerged from the darkness. It didn't move like a human. It floated, almost gliding above the ground, its eyes burning with an otherworldly intelligence. I drew the circle as instructed, placing the blade at the center. Chanting the incantation, I felt the shadows thrash, scream, and writhe, trying to break free, their whispers escalating into a deafening roar. The forest seemed alive, the trees bending and twisting as if watching the confrontation. I poured every ounce of my focus into the ritual, repeating the words over and over. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed meaningless. And then, silence. The shadows collapsed into themselves, sucked into the circle, the forest still and quiet once more. I collapsed to the ground, shaking, exhausted. I had done it, or so I thought. When I returned home, the house seemed different, quieter, calmer. The shadows no longer followed me from room to room. Sleep came easier, though dreams of the forest still haunted me. I knew the entity wasn't gone. It was contained, bound, but still aware, waiting for the next opportunity. And I would never, ever let my guard down again. Days passed, but the tension never left me. Even though the entity was bound to the circle in the forest, a part of me could feel its gaze lingering, watching from the shadows. Every night, I would hear faint whispers, almost like the wind carrying voices, taunting me. The house, though seemingly calm, still held traces of its malevolent energy. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. My mental state was deteriorating. I needed distance, clarity, a sense of normalcy. I packed what I could carry and stayed temporarily with a friend in the city. Yet, even there, I couldn't escape. Nightmares plagued me. In my dreams, the forest consumed me. Shadowy figures clawed at my skin, dragging me into darkness. Weeks later, I returned cautiously, determined to confront the remaining presence. I brought with me every protective charm, every tool I had used before. My plan was simple: maintain the ritual, reinforce the boundaries, and ensure the entity could not escape. But as I stepped inside the house, I realized something terrifying. The entity had adapted. Objects moved subtly when I wasn't looking. Shadows flickered unnaturally across walls. The air felt thicker, oppressive, almost alive. I could hear the faintest scratching at the attic door, faint whispers in the hallways. It was learning my patterns, predicting my actions. I was dealing with intelligence beyond human understanding. Determined, I returned to the forest. The circle was intact, but the entity sensed my approach. The shadows coalesced into a humanoid form, taller than before, its presence radiating a malevolent awareness. I tightened my grip on the ritual blade and began chanting. The entity screamed, a sound no human throat could produce, piercing my ears, rattling my bones. The forest itself seemed to shake, trees bending as if the entire world was aware of the struggle. I repeated the incantation faster, sweat and fear blurring together. The circle glowed brighter, feeding on my willpower. For hours, it resisted, clawing at reality itself. I was exhausted, my hands bleeding from gripping the blade too tightly. But I could not stop. I realized the entity was more than a ghost. It was a curse, a manifestation of all the malevolent energy accumulated in that place over centuries. Finally, with one last scream, the entity was sucked into the circle. The shadows dissipated, leaving an eerie stillness. I collapsed, trembling, my body and mind at their limit. I had won, but the victory was hollow. I knew it would only be contained, never destroyed. Its awareness lingered, biding its time. Returning home, the house felt safer, but I knew I could never truly relax. Every corner, every creak reminded me that the entity was still watching, still aware. My life slowly returned to a semblance of normality, but the experience had changed me forever. I had glimpsed something ancient, malevolent, and utterly alien. I never spoke of it to anyone outside of my research. People wouldn't understand. They would call me crazy, paranoid. But I know the truth. The house, the woods, the entity, they exist. And if anyone dares enter that forest unprepared, they will face horrors beyond imagination. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear faint scratching at my window, or glimpses of shadows in the corner of my eye. I know the entity is still there, watching, waiting. And I know that one day it will test me again. The following weeks were a blur of unease. I returned to the house with heavy packs, carrying every tool I thought could protect me: salt, ritual charms, talismans, and the ancient blade I had discovered during my research. I knew I could not fight this entity as one fights a human adversary. It was something else entirely. Something that fed on fear, on life, on sanity. The air inside the house felt thicker than ever. I could hear faint breathing in the walls, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind, but persistent enough to rattle my nerves. Every floorboard creak made my heart skip a beat. Shadows moved when I wasn't looking, stretching unnaturally, always in my peripheral vision. I set up protective circles in every room, marking boundaries with salt, inscribed runes, and iron. Yet, even as I completed the rituals, a gnawing doubt crept into my mind. Was I truly containing it, or merely delaying the inevitable? Night fell, and I stayed vigilant. I could hear the entity moving, almost anticipating my actions. It would appear briefly in the corner of my eyes, a tall, dark figure, distorted, humanoid yet wrong in every possible way. Its presence carried weight, as if gravity itself twisted around it. I could feel my bones ache just from its gaze. By the third night, it became bolder. Objects moved across rooms while I was sleeping. Doors opened and slammed shut without wind. Whispers echoed in languages I couldn't understand. My dreams were no longer dreams. They were rehearsals for the terror awaiting me when awake. One night, I woke to a loud bang upstairs. I had fortified the rooms, yet the sound came from the attic, the source of its previous hauntings. I grabbed the ritual blade, tightened my grip, and climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the floorboard sounding like a drumbeat announcing my doom. Reaching the attic, I saw the shadows coalesce into a towering humanoid form. Its eyes were deep voids, blacker than any night sky, reflecting a malevolent intelligence. It spoke, not in words but in thoughts. Messages imprinted themselves in my mind, feeding my fears, dredging up every memory of vulnerability I had ever experienced. I tried to resist, repeating the protective incantations. The entity shrieked, an unbearable sound that made my blood run cold. The walls trembled, the floor shook, and for a moment I feared the house itself would collapse. Then, something unexpected happened. The entity hesitated, flickering between form and shadow. It recoiled from the blade, as if recognizing its threat. I pressed the advantage, advancing slowly, chanting louder, reinforcing every ward, every circle, every mark of protection. Hours passed. The entity shrieked, vanished, returned, only to dissipate again. By dawn, the house was silent. Exhausted, I collapsed, unsure whether I had won or merely survived another round. I knew one truth. This was not the end. The sun barely rose that morning, yet the house felt heavier than the night before. Shadows clung to corners, moving just a fraction slower than I could blink, mocking the idea that I had any control. I knew that the entity had not left. It had only retreated, regrouped, waiting for its next opportunity. I decided to explore the lower basement, the room I had avoided since the first night of terror. The air was damp and smelled of decay. Dust motes floated like tiny phantoms in the weak beam of my flashlight. Every creak, every whisper, every tiny scratch made my skin crawl. I found old, rotting furniture and broken toys scattered across the floor, signs that previous occupants had likely experienced horrors similar to mine. One corner of the basement drew my attention. There was a small door, previously unnoticed, covered in thick cobwebs. Trembling, I reached for the handle. The metal was icy cold, and as soon as my fingers touched it, a rush of energy shot through me. A voice, or perhaps a thought, pressed into my mind, "Do not enter, or you will join them." Fear clawed at me, but curiosity and a desperate need to understand outweighed it. I pulled open the door. A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness. I could feel the temperature drop sharply, my breath forming misty clouds. Every step echoed like the beating of a funeral drum. At the bottom, I found a small, circular room. The walls were covered with strange symbols, carved deep into the stone, pulsating faintly with a dim, greenish light. In the center lay a shallow pit, filled with dark water that reflected the ceiling as if it were a mirror. But the reflection was wrong. It showed me not as I was, but distorted, as if twisted by fear itself. Suddenly, the pit rippled. I stepped back instinctively. Something emerged, a shadowy form, taller and thinner than any human, with limbs that bent in unnatural angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it watching me, studying me, learning my fears. It spoke again, directly into my mind. "You cannot stop me. You can only delay what is inevitable." I tried to speak aloud, to assert myself, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The creature moved closer, and the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of iron and rot. My heart pounded violently, threatening to burst through my chest. Then, instinctively, I raised the ritual blade I had carried from my room. The entity recoiled, hissing as if I had cut it with invisible fire. I slashed at it, chanting incantations as the symbols on the walls seemed to glow brighter, responding to my fear and determination. The battle felt endless. The shadow lunged, then retreated. I advanced, then paused, both of us locked in a deadly dance. I could feel the house trembling, walls bending slightly under the weight of its presence. Dust and debris swirled around me, creating a storm inside that tiny, cursed room. Hours seemed to pass in mere minutes. Every fiber of my being screamed exhaustion, but I refused to let it overpower me. I remembered the talisman, the small amulet I had hidden in my pocket. I held it out, whispering a protective chant I had memorized. The shadow shrieked, a sound that shattered glass in my mind, and recoiled as if burned. Finally, with one last desperate effort, it dissipated, melting into the air like smoke. The green glow from the walls faded, leaving me in near darkness. My heart raced. My body shook. But for the first time in days, the basement was quiet. I knew deep down that it wasn't gone forever. It had retreated, wounded but intelligent. And I was left with the terrifying certainty that it would return, stronger and more cunning, waiting for the next night, the next opportunity to break me completely. I climbed the stairs slowly, emerging into the dim morning light. The house seemed normal, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Every creak of the floor, every shadow on the wall, every sound of the wind through the trees would remind me that I was never truly safe here. Even though morning light streamed through the dusty windows, my nerves remained raw. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like the whisper of the entity I had just fought. My hands still trembled from the basement encounter, and the talisman in my pocket felt like the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. I forced myself to move through the house, trying to check every corner, every darkened room. Nothing seemed out of place. The heavy curtains swayed gently in the breeze, and yet I felt eyes on me. I kept the flashlight ready, even as the sun climbed higher. The house that should have felt safe now felt alien, as if every shadow contained a memory, every whisper held intent. By midday, I forced myself to leave the house, needing fresh air to calm my racing heart. I walked slowly through the wooded property, scanning for movement. The trees whispered with the wind, their branches scratching against each other like skeletal fingers. As I walked, I noticed footprints, barefoot, too large to belong to me, leading back toward the house. My pulse quickened. The entity wasn't gone. It had retreated, yes, but it was still watching. When I returned inside, I found a new sign of intrusion. The talisman I had placed near my bedside was moved slightly, not enough to be noticeable at first glance, but the shift was deliberate. I could feel its presence. The shadow wasn't just a threat. It was intelligent, aware, adapting. Night came, and with it, the oppressive silence that had haunted me before. I couldn't sleep. Every small sound, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind against the window, felt amplified. Around midnight, I heard the faint scraping sound again, coming from the attic. I took the talisman and a flashlight, my hand trembling as I ascended the steps to the attic. The door was partially open, swinging gently as if pushed by a breeze that didn't exist. I pushed it fully open and stepped inside. The room smelled of mold and something far more disturbing: decay, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of blood. The attic was mostly empty, save for scattered boxes and old furniture. My flashlight illuminated an old trunk in the corner. Something compelled me to approach it. I lifted the lid carefully, revealing a pile of old journals. The pages were yellowed and brittle, and the handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. As I skimmed through, I realized these were logs from the previous occupants, detailing their own encounters with the entity. One entry, dated over 50 years ago, described a shadow much like the one I faced, capable of moving between rooms silently, waiting for fear to manifest, feeding off it, growing stronger. Another entry spoke of a protective talisman similar to mine, noting that it only delayed the inevitable. The last line of that entry made my blood run cold. It waits in the shadows, and it never forgets. A sudden movement caught my eye. In the far corner of the attic, a figure materialized. Not fully formed, a wisp of darkness stretching and bending unnaturally. It hovered silently, watching me with intent. My breath caught. I realized then that the fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. I raised the talisman, chanting under my breath, the only defense I had left. The shadow recoiled slightly, but it wasn't enough. Its form rippled, splitting into multiple shadowy appendages, reaching for me. My heart raced, panic clawed at my mind, but I focused, forcing myself to remember the incantation that had temporarily repelled it. The shadows writhed, hissing and recoiling from the talisman's glow. The attic trembled slightly, dust falling from the rafters. I knew the struggle was only temporary. The entity was patient, immortal in its own way, and it would not forgive my intrusion. Finally, the shadows withdrew, melting into the corners of the room. The attic was silent again, but the oppressive sense of being watched didn't leave. I knew I had survived this encounter, but the house had left its mark on me. Something had changed. The house wasn't just a home. It was a trap, a living entity, and it was far from finished with me. The night that followed was unbearable. I barely slept, sitting upright in the living room with the talisman clenched in my fist. Every shadow cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, as if mocking me. The house was alive. I was certain of it. It was studying me, testing me, waiting for the exact moment I let my guard down. By dawn, my exhaustion had reached a breaking point. My body ached from tension, my mind was fraying at the edges. But I had no choice. I had to confront the attic again. It had become clear that the entity wasn't going to leave. It was drawn to fear, to presence, and I had no more room to run. I climbed the attic steps once more, flashlight in hand, talisman ready. The floorboards groaned under my weight, louder than usual, echoing through the silence. As I reached the top, I saw it, an indistinct form at the far corner, darker than darkness itself, shifting subtly with a will of its own. It moved as I moved, as if anticipating every step. I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling but defiant. "I know what you are. I won't let you take me." The shadow paused, almost reacting to my words. It hissed softly, a sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. Its form began to solidify, revealing vague humanoid features. Long, spindly limbs, glowing eyes that pierced the dim light, and a presence that radiated malice. I raised the talisman, repeating the incantation I had memorized from the journals. The glow from the charm intensified, filling the attic with light that seemed almost unnatural. The shadow recoiled violently, letting out a sound like 1,000 whispers all at once. Dust swirled around me as the entity writhed, and for the first time I felt a surge of power. But the relief was short-lived. The shadow didn't retreat completely. Instead, it multiplied, splitting into smaller forms that crept along the walls, under furniture, and into the corners of the attic. My pulse raced. I realized that I was fighting not one, but many manifestations of the same malevolent entity. I backed toward the attic stairs, keeping the talisman between myself and the shadows. Every step was a battle. The air felt thick and heavy, almost solid. The shadows reached for me, cold and insubstantial, yet filled with intent. I slammed the attic door behind me, forcing it shut and bolting it with every ounce of strength I had left. Breathing heavily, I leaned against the door, realizing that the talisman had only bought me time. The house had chosen me as its prey. I knew I couldn't leave, couldn't escape, without confronting the entity in full. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I prepared for what I knew was coming. Using the journals as a guide, I set up protective symbols throughout the house, burned herbs mentioned in the texts, and reinforced my mental focus. The entity would test me again tonight. I could feel it, crawling at the edges of perception. As darkness fell, the house seemed to close in. Every hallway stretched longer, every shadow grew deeper. The air was thick with anticipation. And then, I heard it, the faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound, moving toward the attic. My heart raced as I gripped the talisman. It was time. The final confrontation was at hand. The scraping grew louder, sharper, closer. My hands shook as I gripped the talisman, repeating the incantation under my breath. Every syllable felt heavy, as if the words themselves were trying to push back against the darkness. The air thickened, almost suffocating, carrying a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. Then, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the attic, moving with impossible speed. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt paralyzed, trapped in a gaze that seemed to pierce through my very soul. I forced myself to act. I raised the talisman higher, and a blinding light erupted from it. The shadow shrieked, a sound that made my teeth ache and my ears bleed. But it didn't vanish. It writhed, multiplied again, and began circling me in a chaotic frenzy. I realized the talisman alone wasn't enough. I had to combine it with the protective symbols I had drawn around the house. With adrenaline pumping, I sprinted down the attic stairs, placing candles and sigils as I went, chanting louder now. The shadows followed, but the light from the candles made them hesitate, giving me precious seconds. I could hear whispers now, hundreds of voices, some pleading, some mocking. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, echoing through the wooden floors. My vision blurred, sweat poured down my face. But I refused to stop. One by one, I completed each protective circle, until finally I returned to the attic. The shadows recoiled from the symbols. The largest one, the entity itself, hesitated at the edge of the attic, its form flickering like a dying flame. I stepped forward, talisman raised, and shouted the final words of the incantation. The air trembled, the floorboards groaned, and a piercing scream filled the house, so loud it felt like the walls themselves were shattering. Then, silence. The shadows dissolved, evaporating into mist. The house settled, as if exhaling after a long, tense moment. I sank to the floor, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't believe I had survived. For hours, I sat in the attic, clutching the talisman, listening for any sign of the entity's return. Nothing came. The house was quiet, eerily so, as though it had acknowledged my victory, but also issued a silent warning it would never forget. By morning, I emerged from the attic, physically and mentally drained. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt alien, almost sacred. I had survived the night, but I knew the memory of those eyes, the scraping sounds, the shadows multiplying in the darkness, would haunt me forever. I made one final decision. I would leave the house. No amount of curiosity, no sense of ownership, was worth returning to that nightmare. I packed my essentials, locked the door behind me, and never looked back. Even now, years later, I occasionally dream of that attic, of shadows waiting just beyond the corner of my vision. And I know deep down that somewhere in that house the darkness still waits, patient, eternal, and hungry. After leaving the house, I thought the nightmare was over. The car engine hummed beneath me as I drove down the deserted road, but the emptiness of the woods only amplified the silence in my mind. Every shadow in the corner of my vision made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the scraping I had barely survived. I decided to stay in a nearby motel that night. The room was small, plain, and lacking in any charm, but it felt safer than the house I had just escaped. I unpacked minimally, placing the talisman on the nightstand next to my bed. Its faint glow comforted me, though I knew it could not hold back the dark forever. Hours later, sleep came, but not peace. In my dreams, the shadows returned, creeping along the walls, whispering my name. I could feel their cold fingers brushing against my skin, dragging me down into the darkness. My eyes shot open, and I realized I was no longer in the motel room, but in the attic of that cursed house. The smell of old wood and decay was suffocating. A voice echoed from the darkness, low and guttural. "You cannot leave." My heart pounded as I backed away, only to find the door had vanished. I was trapped. The shadows surged, moving faster, growing in size, their whispers becoming shrill screams. My mind raced. How could something from my nightmares follow me here? Then I remembered the talisman. I reached for it instinctively, holding it aloft. Light radiated from it, and the shadows shrieked, retreating slightly. But the entity itself was still there, larger than life, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It spoke, though not in words I could understand, more like a mental invasion, a voice that bypassed ears and spoke directly into my consciousness. You took what was mine. Panic surged through me. I didn't take anything. I just survived. I shouted into the dark, my voice barely registering against the entity's presence. It lunged, and I stumbled back, tripping over unseen objects in the dream-like attic. My talisman flickered, struggling against the overwhelming darkness. I remembered the protective circles I had drawn in the real house. They hadn't all been complete. The final symbols were missing. I had underestimated the entity's power. Then, a thought struck me. If I could recreate the ritual here, even in this dream state, maybe I could fight it. With trembling hands, I began drawing the symbols in the dust on the floor, chanting the incantations I had memorized. The entity screamed in frustration, its form distorting, stretching, twisting as my confidence and focus grew. Hours, or maybe minutes, time felt meaningless, passed as I chanted, drawing and repeating. Sweat poured down my face. My lungs burned, and my vision blurred, but I refused to stop. Finally, the talisman's light grew blinding, engulfing the entire attic. The shadows screamed one last time before dissolving into nothingness. Silence fell. My body collapsed, and I awoke to the dim light of the motel room. The nightmare had ended, but my hands were covered in scratches, my clothes torn as if the shadows had tried to follow me into reality. I packed my belongings quickly that morning, and decided I could no longer ignore the truth. The house in the woods was not just a building. It was a living, breathing entity of darkness. It fed on fear, growing stronger with each encounter. And though I had survived, I knew I would never be free from its reach. The following days were a blur of anxiety and hyper-awareness. Every shadow, every creak, every whisper of wind made me jump. I couldn't stay in one place for long, but I also couldn't shake the memory of the talisman and the ritual that had saved me. Somehow, I knew that the house, and whatever force lived within it, had not finished with me. I tried to return to normal life, but my friends noticed a change. I was jumpy, paranoid, and constantly distracted. The nightmares continued, often waking me in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, clutching at the empty air. I didn't tell anyone about the visions. Who would believe a grown man being haunted by a house? Then one night, the phone rang. It was a local number I didn't recognize. Hesitant, I answered, expecting a prank, but there was only breathing on the other end, heavy, deliberate, and unnervingly close. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. Silence, and then a voice, low and distorted. "You cannot hide." My blood ran cold. The call ended before I could respond. I sat frozen, realizing that the house had found another way to reach me. It wasn't bound by walls or doors. It had power, and it was relentless. The next day, I decided to return to the edge of the forest near the house. I needed answers. Maybe confronting it head-on again, while prepared, would give me some control. I packed the talisman, additional protective herbs, and the ritual notes, and I drove silently to the dirt road that led to the property. As I approached, the familiar feeling of dread washed over me. The forest seemed darker, thicker, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching. Every footstep on the dirt road felt amplified. The house was visible through the fog, silent, empty, yet it radiated a presence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I circled the house cautiously, examining the ground for signs of disturbance. That's when I noticed something new. A series of deep claw marks along the walls and window frames. They were fresh. Whatever had attacked me before, it had been back. And it had been stronger. I set up the talisman at the edge of the clearing and drew protective symbols in a wide circle, just like before. My hands shook, but I focused, chanting softly under my breath. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, rattling branches and making the house groan. It was aware of my presence. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep from inside the house. 1, 2, 3. The floorboards creaked as something moved toward the window facing me. I held my breath, clutching the talisman, watching the shadowy outline approach. And then, it stopped. The figure appeared. A twisted silhouette, more humanoid than shadow, but grotesque. Its head tilted unnaturally, like a puppet on invisible strings. Its eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized it was aware of the ritual, aware of my attempt to defend myself. I had a choice: retreat or confront it. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the edge of the protective circle. The figure mimicked my movements, circling the house, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one, it was multiplying. Shadows, malformed and grotesque, started appearing behind it, each one whispering my name in distorted voices. Panic surged, but I forced myself to focus. I chanted louder, drawing energy from the talisman and the herbs I had sprinkled in the circle. The shadows shrieked, recoiling slightly. One of them lunged toward me, only to hit an invisible barrier. The ritual was working, but barely. I realized then that I could not defeat this alone. I needed guidance, someone who understood the dark forces at play. My mind raced back to the old woman I had heard about from the townsfolk, the one who lived deep in the forest, rumored to have dealt with similar entities. Maybe she could help me strengthen the ritual. Before I could act, the shadows surged again, and I felt a cold pressure in my chest, like invisible hands trying to pull me into the forest. I held the talisman tighter, screaming my defiance, and in that moment the shadows withdrew, hissing like wind through dead branches. I ran to my car without looking back, my pulse racing. That night, I knew the next steps would determine whether I survived, or whether the house would finally claim me. The following day, I couldn't bring myself to stay home. Sleep had become impossible, and the thought of returning to the forest alone was terrifying. But I had no choice. I had to understand what I was dealing with. I drove toward the forest, the dirt road crunching under my tires. The fog clung to the trees like a living blanket, obscuring the path ahead. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel, my eyes scanning for any movement, any sign that the shadows had followed me. When I reached the clearing near the house, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just the faint creak of the house in the distance. The talisman I carried felt heavier than usual, as if it was aware of the impending danger. I decided to set up a series of protective markers around the perimeter of the house, expanding the ritual circle I had drawn the night before. As I worked, I noticed symbols carved into the trees surrounding the property, twisted runes that pulsed with a faint, dark light. Someone, or something, had been here since my last visit. I took a deep breath and entered the house, my flashlight cutting through the thick shadows inside. The air was damp and smelled of decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight, echoing through the empty rooms. Every corner I turned, every doorway I passed, seemed to twist and shift, as if the house itself were alive. In the living room, I saw it. A shadow crouched near the fireplace, its form writhing unnaturally. It seemed to sense my presence, because it slowly raised a hand, long, thin fingers ending in blackened claws, and pointed directly at me. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to take a step forward, chanting the incantation from the ritual notes. The talisman glowed faintly, and the shadow recoiled, letting out a shrill, unnatural scream. I moved deeper into the house, reaching the basement stairs. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, though I had locked it before. My pulse quickened, but I knew I had to descend. Whatever haunted this house was gathering strength there. The basement was colder than expected, the walls slick with moisture. Two more shadows emerged, forming a triangle with the one from the living room. Their whispers filled the air, unintelligible but maddening, and I felt my mind strain against the psychic weight of their presence. I raised the talisman high, chanting louder, feeling the energy radiate from it in a protective dome around me. The shadows hissed, clawing at the edges of the circle, but couldn't penetrate it. One of them lunged, only to be thrown back by an invisible force. Then I saw it. A doorway at the back of the basement that hadn't been there before. Dark, pulsating, as if it were breathing. My instinct screamed to flee, but I knew this was the key. Whatever lay beyond that door had been controlling the house and the shadows all along. I stepped closer, each footfall heavy with dread. The whispers grew louder, now forming words I could almost understand. Leave or join. Forever. I tightened my grip on the talisman, took a deep breath, and opened the doorway. The darkness beyond was suffocating, blacker than any night I had ever known. Shapes twisted in the void, some humanoid, some utterly alien. The shadows I had fought earlier merged with this darkness, forming a massive, writhing entity that pulsed with malevolent intent. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I held my ground. I raised the talisman, chanting the final protective incantation. Light flared from it, pushing back the darkness, illuminating the grotesque forms writhing before me. The shadows screeched, twisting and dissolving into the black void. For a moment, everything was still. Then a single voice, hollow and echoing, spoke. "This is not over." The doorway collapsed into nothingness, leaving the basement as it had been, quiet, empty. But I knew it had not truly vanished. The next morning, I barely slept. My body ached. My mind refused to rest. Even daylight brought no relief. The forest seemed darker, heavier, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. I knew the entity had not been destroyed, only delayed. I decided to return to the house, this time with additional precautions. I brought salt, iron, and protective charms, everything I had learned from old grimoires and local legends. My research had uncovered something terrifying. The house had been built on a site of ancient rituals, a place meant to summon and trap spirits, feeding them with fear. As I drove down the narrow, winding road leading to the forest, I noticed something unusual. The trees seemed to lean toward the path, their branches twisting as if reaching for me. The air was thick, almost viscous, making every breath a struggle. My talisman pulsed in my pocket, vibrating slightly, warning me of an imminent presence. Upon reaching the clearing, the house loomed like a dark sentinel. The fog clung even tighter now, obscuring details, making shadows seem alive. I parked my car at a safe distance, grabbed my gear, and approached on foot. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted my passage. The front door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open, but instinct told me the entity had returned. I whispered a protective chant, stepping inside cautiously. The house smelled of damp earth and decay. A faint echo of the basement encounter the previous night. The living room was empty, but the shadows flickered in the corners, responding to my presence. I began my protective ritual, carefully spreading salt along the thresholds, drawing symbols of power on the floors and walls. The talisman glowed brighter as I worked, reacting to the lingering malevolent energy. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate clapping, echoing from the staircase. I froze, listening. Each clap was deliberate, measured, and chilling. The sound grew closer, climbing the stairs, and I realized it was not a trick of the mind. Something was moving above me. I gripped my talisman tightly, chanting aloud. The clapping stopped, replaced by whispers, unintelligible at first, but gradually forming words. "You cannot leave. Not yet." The air thickened, and I felt a cold hand brush past my neck. I spun around, flashlight raised, but nothing was there. Yet the shadows around me pulsed, writhing with intent, as if the house itself were alive and breathing. Determined, I descended to the basement. The stairs creaked underfoot, and the darkness below seemed to stretch, swallowing my flashlight beam. I entered the basement and saw traces of the previous encounter: disturbed dust, faint claw marks on the walls, and symbols carved into the floor. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air had weight. I began the final protective ritual, using iron filings and salt to form a containment circle around the basement. The talisman glowed fiercely, illuminating the room. Then I saw movement, shadows coalescing into humanoid forms, eyes glowing faintly red, faces twisted in silent screams. They lunged at me, but the protective circle held. I chanted faster, feeling a surge of power emanate from the talisman. The shadows hissed, twisting and contorting, as if in agony. One of them, larger than the rest, emerged from the darkness. It had a face like melting wax, eyes hollow, and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It spoke in a voice like grinding metal. "Your light cannot save you forever." I screamed the incantation, throwing all my energy into the ritual. The talisman blazed with a blinding light, forcing the shadows back. The house shook violently, dust and debris raining down. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced my skull, echoing in every corner of the room. Finally, silence. The shadows dissolved into mist, retreating into the corners, leaving the basement eerily still. I collapsed, trembling, sweat and blood mingling on my skin. I knew this was only a temporary victory. The house still held power, and I would need to return, prepared for the confrontation that would end the haunting once and for all. I spent the next few days recovering, though sleep barely came. Every time my eyes closed, I saw shadows writhing in the corners of my mind, and I woke up drenched in sweat. Even in daylight, the house haunted my thoughts, calling me back as if it had a will of its own. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The containment circle had only held the entity temporarily. I needed a permanent solution, something that would banish it completely. I turned to the old texts I had found, ancient grimoires written by occultists who had dealt with spirits far darker than this one. One ritual stood out, a banishment that required a mixture of elemental power, fire, iron, salt, and light. The instructions were detailed and meticulous, and any mistake could make the entity stronger. I gathered everything I needed: iron rods, candles, salt, herbs, and the talisman. The night I returned, a thick fog blanketed the forest, rolling like waves around the house. The trees groaned as the wind twisted through their branches, whispering warnings I could barely understand. My heart pounded as I approached the front door, clutching the talisman like a lifeline. The house seemed aware. Shadows shifted unnaturally across the walls, even in the faint glow of my flashlight. I felt them watching me, 100 unseen eyes tracking every movement. I entered cautiously, reciting protective incantations under my breath. Each step toward the basement felt like a battle. The air thickened, resistance against my every motion. The house groaned as though it resented my presence. Once I reached the basement, I drew the banishment circle with iron filings and salt, lighting the candles at precise intervals. I placed the talisman in the center and began the incantation, voice trembling but determined. The shadows immediately reacted, writhing violently, forming humanoid shapes with grotesque, melting faces. One advanced, stretching impossibly, attempting to break the circle. I pressed my hands together, chanting faster, focusing all my energy on the talisman. A sudden gust of wind extinguished half the candles, and the shadows surged forward, the largest one raising a hand as if to strike me. The talisman flared with blinding light, forcing it back. The house shook violently, the ceiling cracking and dust raining down. I screamed the final lines of the incantation, forcing the light outward, spreading to every corner of the basement. The shadows screamed, a sound like metal grinding on bone, then shrank and dissolved into mist. The largest figure, the one with the wax-like face, roared one last time before vanishing entirely. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but a strange sense of relief washed over me. The house no longer felt alive in the same way. It was dormant, as if the entity had finally been banished. I spent the next few hours cleaning up, reinforcing the protective charms, and ensuring that nothing could summon the entity again. When I finally left, I glanced back at the house. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the old structure in the moonlight. For the first time, it seemed, just a house. I knew I had won, but I also knew this experience would stay with me forever. The shadows, the whispers, and the terror, they would remain in my memories, a reminder of the night I stared death in the face and survived. The following morning, the sunlight felt foreign, almost intrusive. I had expected relief after the banishment, but instead, an uneasy tension lingered in my chest. The forest surrounding the house seemed quieter than usual, unnaturally quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I decided to inspect the perimeter of the property, checking that no lingering traces of the entity remained. As I walked, the forest shadows seemed to stretch toward me, bending in impossible ways. Every step I took felt watched, but the previous night's victory gave me a cautious confidence. Near the old oak at the edge of the woods, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the bark were symbols, ancient and jagged, some resembling the markings from the grimoires. They weren't there the night before. Someone, or something, had left them while I slept. A chill ran down my spine. The entity might be gone, but something else had been awakened. I traced the symbols with trembling fingers, feeling a faint pulse under my skin, like the trees themselves were alive and breathing. I returned inside, locking every door and window. Even with the protective charms, I could feel the house's pulse, subtle but insistent, as though it were aware of me once more. The shadows no longer roamed, but they had left a presence, a lingering darkness that clung to the corners of every room. As night fell, I prepared for bed with heightened caution. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I double-checked the talisman and the charms, then positioned myself in the bedroom with a flashlight and my phone within reach. Around midnight, the noises began again, not from the basement this time, but above me. Footsteps creaked along the attic floor. I froze, holding my breath, listening. They weren't slow like before. These were deliberate, methodical, moving as if someone or something was pacing. I mustered my courage and whispered an incantation from the grimoire, hoping to repel whatever was up there. The footsteps paused, then resumed, faster this time, circling the attic above my bedroom. A faint scraping sound accompanied them, like claws on wood. I grabbed my baseball bat and slowly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the shadows along the walls flickered unnaturally. My heart pounded as I climbed the attic stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight. Reaching the top, I flipped on the light. The attic was empty, yet the air felt heavy, almost viscous. The shadows seemed to pulse, gathering at the far corner. I took a step forward, and the talisman around my neck burned with sudden intensity. Suddenly, the shadows surged, forming a humanoid figure taller than any human should be. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its limbs bent at impossible angles. I swung the bat, but it passed through the form like smoke, eliciting a guttural scream that rattled the walls. The entity lunged, but the talisman flared, creating a barrier of blinding light. The figure recoiled, screaming as it twisted and writhed. I chanted, voice cracking but forceful, repeating the banishment words from the grimoire. The attic shook violently, dust and debris raining down around me. Hours passed, though it felt like days. When the light finally dimmed, the figure had vanished. The attic was silent, and the oppressive feeling had lifted slightly, though I could sense a distant awareness still lingering. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the floor. I had survived another night, but I knew this wasn't over. The house in the woods had more secrets to reveal, and I was only beginning to understand its dark nature. The following morning, sunlight did little to ease the tension in the house. Every shadow felt heavier, as if it had mass. I moved cautiously through each room, checking the protective charms and the talisman around my neck. Every sound, a creak, a gust of wind, made my pulse spike. Breakfast was a silent affair. I couldn't eat much, my appetite swallowed by the fear that lingered like smoke. The previous night's encounter in the attic had left a mark, a residue of dread that clung to the air. By mid-morning, I decided I needed to explore the basement again. Despite the horrors I'd faced there, I had to understand the depth of the house's dark history. Armed with a flashlight and the baseball bat, I descended the creaking stairs, each step echoing like a scream in the stillness. The basement was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Dust motes floated in the shafts of my flashlight, disturbed by the sudden movement of air. The corpses from before were gone, vanished without a trace. I scoured the room, looking for any clue, any remnant of the dark presence that haunted this place. Then I noticed them, scratches, deep and jagged, running along the walls. They weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols that seemed to writhe when I looked away. My stomach turned. These were ancient sigils, warnings of something far older than me. Suddenly, a whisper echoed from the far corner of the basement, almost too faint to hear. "You shouldn't be here." My flashlight flickered, plunging me into brief darkness before illuminating the room again. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming a cacophony of voices. They called my name, mocking me, beckoning me deeper. I advanced cautiously, shining the light across the basement. My breath came in ragged gasps. The shadows in the corners shifted, stretching unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled people. Twisted, elongated figures frozen in silent torment. A sudden cold gust slammed into my back. I spun around, swinging the bat instinctively, but there was nothing there. Then, from behind the stacks of old boxes, a figure emerged. A woman, her face pale and eyes hollow, dripping with shadow. She whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone, "Leave now, or join us." I stumbled backward, tripping over debris. The flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning wildly and casting chaotic shadows. The bat felt useless in my hands, as though the darkness itself was absorbing my strength. Desperate, I remembered the talisman. I raised it high, chanting the protective incantations, and the figure screamed, retreating into the shadows. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, then faded, leaving only silence. I didn't linger. I fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My hands were shaking, sweat running down my face. I had survived, but I knew the basement had more secrets, and whatever had just appeared wasn't finished with me. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. The forest seemed to murmur in response, its dark presence watching, waiting. I realized that no matter how many nights I endured, the house would never let me feel safe again. The following night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the dark corners of the house, made my heart jump. I couldn't shake the memory of the shadowy woman in the basement, her hollow eyes etched into my mind. I paced the living room, flashlight in hand, running through protective chants I barely remembered. The air smelled heavier tonight, metallic, like blood mixed with decay. I shivered, realizing that the house itself seemed alive, breathing, watching. Around midnight, the sound started, a low hum, almost imperceptible at first, vibrating through the walls and floor. It grew louder, a tone that penetrated my chest and made my teeth chatter. I followed it instinctively toward the attic. The attic door creaked as I pulled it open. Darkness swallowed me, thicker than the night outside. My flashlight's beam flickered across boxes and old furniture, and there it was, another figure. This one was taller, cloaked in shadow, face completely hidden. It didn't move, didn't blink, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. Then the scratching began, nails scraping the wooden beams above, moving from one side of the attic to the other. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body rooted itself to the spot. The figure began to drift toward me, silent, gliding as if the floor wasn't even there. Suddenly, a scream cut through the attic, a child's cry, high-pitched and agonizing. The shadow twisted violently, its face contorting into something monstrous, a blur of human and inhuman features. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath forming in front of me. I raised the talisman, chanting frantically, but it seemed weaker tonight. The shadow recoiled, then surged forward with impossible speed. I swung the bat, but my hands passed through it, as if it weren't solid. Pain shot through my chest, not physical, but mental, as though the shadow was burrowing into my thoughts, feeding on my fear. I stumbled backward, tripping over a box, and the shadow disappeared into the corner, leaving only the echo of laughter, hollow, mirthless, and endless. My mind screamed, a war between logic and terror. I knew I couldn't stay here alone. The house had marked me, and I was its target. I ran down the stairs and out into the night, gasping for air. The forest seemed alive, branches reaching for me, whispering in a language older than time. I didn't stop until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, painting the sky in weak light. By morning, I returned cautiously. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. No traces of the shadow, no signs of the child's cry, just the creaking house, the indifferent forest, and the oppressive silence. But I knew better. The house was waiting, and I had only postponed the inevitable. As I fortified the doors and windows, I realized that the basement was only the beginning. Something deeper, older, more sinister lived here, and it wouldn't rest until I either left or joined it. I woke to another morning, the memory of the attic clawing at the edges of my sanity. Every shadow in the house seemed to twitch as I moved past it. I knew I couldn't stay here. The forest, the house, and whatever haunted its walls were growing bolder. By noon, I had packed essentials, clothes, a flashlight, the talisman, and a few old books I hoped would help me understand what I was facing. I decided to face the basement one final time. I had to know the source of this evil. The door creaked ominously as I descended. The air was colder than the winter outside, thick and oppressive. And then I saw it, the two corpses, just as before. But now, the shadows in the corners of the basement began to twist, rising like black smoke from the floorboards. The woman from the basement appeared again, her eyes hollow, yet glowing faintly red. A voice echoed in my mind, though no one spoke. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed. "You belong to us now." I raised the talisman, praying, chanting, but the shadows moved faster than I could comprehend, encircling me, whispering every fear I had ever held, memories of my childhood, of friends, of mistakes. They were twisting into grotesque shapes, taunting me. Then I remembered something the old books mentioned. Fear feeds them, but confrontation can banish them, if one has the will. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stare into the face of the woman, speaking aloud the incantation from the talisman. The shadows shrieked, recoiling, twisting in pain as light seemed to erupt from the talisman, filling the basement with a blinding radiance. The woman screamed, a sound so inhuman that I fell to my knees, covering my ears. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the basement was empty. The corpses, the shadows, the woman, they were gone. The house felt still, almost normal, though a lingering chill reminded me of the horrors that had occurred. I left the house that day, never looking back. I drove through the forest as dawn broke, the morning sun casting long shadows behind the trees. The house stood silent, waiting, but I would never return. Years have passed since that night. I tell this story to warn others. Some places are not meant to be entered. Some doors never meant to be opened. The forest may seem peaceful, the house quaint, but true evil can lurk in the quietest corners. And once it marks you, it never truly leaves. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I sometimes hear the faint creak of wooden floorboards, or a whisper from the shadows, reminding me I survived, but it remembers me.